Hey everybody, Brayden here. Welcome back to another tournament game analysis video. Today we are going to be covering the first game of the February Excelsior Open. And this is a very interesting one because it goes into a line that you might not expect, that you've probably seen if you've seen some of the other games I've played. But it's a very interesting treatment of the Alpin Sicilian. So let's get into it. My opponent is a candidate master, extremely strong, so we can already set the stage there. I am outrated by quite a bit. So we see e4, c5, and c3. So now I go knight to f6, e5, knight to d5 here. d4, this is all just very, very standard. C takes d4, knight to f3. Of course, you cannot take on c3 without losing your knight on d5. So instead, just developing is more important. C takes on d4, d6, bishop to c4, and this is where it gets interesting. So the kind of natural move is knight b6 here. But actually, there's this other option of d takes on e5. And after d takes e5, you can play this move bishop to e6. So this actually comes from Sam Shankland's Classical Sicilian course. And just one quick thing that I will mention here that I thought was extremely interesting is you might think knight g5 is an immediate problem, and knight g5 will be played, but in this specific position, it's actually a huge mistake. Turns out Black has a stunning move that offers a pretty decent advantage already. If you want to take a minute to try to guess what it is, then I recommend doing that. So the move here is amazingly knight c3. So what's the idea here? First off, their queen is hanging, so they can't take on e6 or anything because we take their queen with mate, like bishop takes e6 and queen takes d1 would be mate. So that's not an option. So what happens if they say go queen b3 and move out of the way? Well, now we can take on c4, and they can't really take back without mate. So shouldn't do that. But okay, fine. What if they just trade and then take on e6? Well, that's why knight c3 was extremely strong, is now you have rook to d1 with mate. So, of course, all of these things are kind of a bit more obvious. So you immediately start realizing, okay, knight takes c3 is the only reasonable move. But after queen takes d1, let's just say knight takes and bishop takes c4, Black has the bishop pair, cannot castle short, which is something that they would clearly want to do with the c-file being still opened, castling long. Even though it's a position with queens off the board, it's still not 100% safe to just castle long here, and Black has a reasonable advantage. So it's a really cool trick. But it's not just that. It's not just a trick and then you have a worse position or something. But there's other things going on here too. So castles was played, g6 and knight g5. And you might be thinking, okay, yeah, but now this is kind of bad. You can't move the bishop. And yeah, if you play something like knight c7 and you just go into this type of ending, this looks extremely bad. Let's just say knight takes, and even bishop takes or something. Yeah, this doesn't look amazing. This bishop will eventually be kind of stuck in the middle of nowhere after moves like f4 are played to try to lock that bishop in. So this is not ideal. But the thing is, you don't have to do that. You can just play bishop g7 and focus on development. And there's very concrete lines here. So after knight takes e6 and f takes e6, this was when I was finally out of prep. I understood that at some point I'll need to play queen a5. That's pretty much the next move. And then things kind of end there. So, yeah, extremely interesting position, and Black is actually fine. These pawns are not actually so easy to take advantage of as long as you play your cards correctly. And luckily in this game, things kind of did go my way. So queen to b3 was played. And this isn't really such a popular move. Normally f4 gets played. And after that, you do see queen a5, and it just prevents development. So, for example, moves like rook d8 will eventually be playable, castling. Even g5 to just break down this structure and open up this bishop are quite strong ideas. But mainly, It's hard to develop comfortably because you're always worried about queen c5 check with this bishop on c4, and the last thing you want to do is end up taking on d5 and just allowing black's pieces to just get out and roam the position freely. So instead, queen to b3 was played, but now I actually have I have two options here. I can castle, which I did in the game, but there's also just knight takes e5. And I was going to do this, but I thought the line that I went for in the game, it just felt a little bit more comfortable. So queen takes c4, knight takes queen takes b7, knight takes c4, queen c6 check, king f7, and queen takes on c4. And then I'd just follow up with like rook f8 and king g8. And I think I'm totally fine here. Of course, I do have the open e file against me now, so if these end up becoming weaknesses, it just feels like they're more likely to become weaknesses. It's not the prettiest position, but it does also look quite decent after moves like king g8 and queen d6, rook c8. The pieces do find nice squares at the very least, so that would be good. Instead, I just castled because queen takes b7. I can just kind of play a variation of that. Instead, I just played knight takes e5 here, and I saw this cool variation. So yeah, I was expecting bishop to e2, and then I saw this move queen d6, and it was like, oh yeah, I should definitely play this. This does not hurt at all to do. And the reason why is because if white makes a normal looking move like h3, they can just find themselves in a lot of trouble. Rook f to b8, queen a6, you can just trade queens now and go knight b4, and black is just winning. There's no way to prevent knight c2 or the loss of the bishop, since the d3 square is covered. So I thought that was quite cool, and very easy trap to fall into. Of course, it's easy to fall into it, but it's also easy not to. As long as you aren't too picky with your development and just say knight c3 is an okay way to develop, then you're going to be fine. And yeah, my opponent was obviously fine because that's what they played. So I played rook a b8 here, setting up another trap. So queen takes a7 would lose the game. Rook a8 actually just wins the queen now. The queen goes back to b7. There's this rook going to b8, and the queen, of course, is trapped. But queen d4, you might be thinking, why not this move? Well, unfortunately, knight f3 check is a discovered attack. Remember, whenever you're looking for potential tactics in a position, always notice alignment, right? So you might be thinking ahead of time, oh yeah, there's just nothing here because, well, of course they can just go to this d4 square, but then you immediately see this bishop, and you should start looking for things like checks, captures, or threats. There's a check here to actually win. So queen to a6 was played. I took on c3. It felt like the natural move, at least damaging their pawn structure. B takes c3, queen takes a6, bishop takes a6. And I wanted to improve my knight as it started to feel a bit uncomfortable on this e5 square. But choosing a square for it was kind of difficult. So I decided that bringing it to d6 would be a potentially really good idea, as it's doing just a little bit better. It stands a little bit better than it does on this e5 square. So I started with knight to f7 here. And after bishop to e3, white is quite active, and that is a little visually scary, but if I play a move like knight to d6, I don't think that there's too many problems. For example, rook a to c1. There's actually this amazing move, rook to f5. Please note that you cannot take this pawn easily, because rook a8 will actually just be winning a full piece here. But rook a c1, yeah, there's this move rook f5 with the idea of going rook a5, just swinging over, and it's actually quite difficult to defend this a pawn, as well as just the c pawn, right? You can always go and play moves like rook a3. So very promising position here. But I ended up taking on c3 because when you see that pawn, you just kind of want to take it. But this is going to create some complications for me. So white does get a lot of activity, and I will actually most likely be losing a pawn, and I'll have to make a pretty difficult choice very soon. So rook a to c1, I played bishop to f6. It just felt better than bishop g7 because at least I have some space for my king. Now we see this move bishop to c4. So this is actually the idea that I missed. Either I lose the e6 pawn or I lose the a7 pawn. And this is actually kind of a quiz for you guys. Which one's more important? It might be obvious, but it also might not be obvious as well. I can totally understand why some people would feel one way about one pawn or one way about the other. So let's talk about the benefits just from a theoretical standpoint, right? The e6 pawn could be better than the a7 pawn because it is controlling more of the center. And the a pawn, well, the a pawn prevents this pawn from being pushed through, right? It is opposing their pawn on the a file. So it's really just about judging which ones are more important. And the answer is actually the a pawn is the most important one to keep. So here, what we should do is we kind of just need to play a5. This has to be done. We need to try to keep this pawn the best we can. The e6 pawn does not mean as much. King g7 was played, and this is a great reason why bishop f6 was so good, is now we can actually move our knight freely. Rook c5, and now a4. So kind of a dream would be to play something like this, a3 and bishop b2. If we can just keep those pawns on the board, even though we have split pawns on the king side here, as long as we can just make sure that they're not getting pawns on both sides of the board or some sort of advantage on both sides, that would be quite bad for us. So rook to a8, a5 was played. Rook to a8, and a very, very smart move from my opponent. Bishop to a7. So now it just looks like this is lost for black. But I have some good news for you guys. This is actually fine. If you throw this into an engine, it'll say +1 for white. But that's because they're winning a pawn. And I'll give you a hint, or not really a hint, but I'll say something here. The advantage doesn't really get bigger than that. It kind of stays around +1 as long as you find the right maneuvers here. And what's a dream scenario for us? So we're losing this pawn. I would say a dream scenario is if somehow, this is kind of a spoiler, we can get a dark squared versus light squared bishop scenario. If we can do that, then it's much, much harder to win. Even with rooks on the board here, they do have this passed pawn, but there's complications. So there is a maneuver we can make. And it actually starts with this move rook f to d8. This is very important because we want to prevent bishop d5 from kicking this rook from the a file. And after rook takes a4, now the surprising maneuver comes in, and that's knight g5. So when you look at weak squares here, you might be thinking, okay, I don't understand how there is any weak squares. But if you just look at it from a perspective of trying to blockade and trying to be as annoying as possible, where does this knight belong? This bishop's great. It's doing a good job making sure they can't get like behind the pawn or anything to start pushing it. But this knight is very, very bad. And you might immediately be thinking, oh, it would be great to have it on like some of these dark squares. And that's actually true. And there's one dark square that's better than the others, and that's the c3 square. And there's actually a pretty easy way to get yourself over there. And it starts with knight g5. And this is why rook d8 was so important. You want to attack this bishop with tempo and make your way over to c3. It looks a little bit difficult at first, but after you see bishop to b3 and you see the next move, you realize that this is actually just going to happen. And black just kind of turns out fine, despite being down a pawn. Is this move knight e4? And they can take it, but then we're getting this opposite color bishop scenario, as mentioned before, which is a huge deal as the defending side when we're down a pawn. They have the bishop pair, and they have all these things going for them. This would be kind of a disaster if they were to allow this. Unfortunately, there's not really much they can do about this. They ended up taking. They felt like that was the best option, and realistically it is. But after rook takes a7, the job becomes a lot easier. It's no longer a job of trying to stave off an attack on both sides. It's just opposite color bishops. Can I make a blockade in time? And can I prevent them from doing anything? And luckily, I am covering one of my only weaknesses, this e7 pawn. And I'm also preventing them from getting active on this long diagonal. So a lot of things are all of a sudden going my way. Now we see rook f to e1. I go rook to d2. Rook 1 to e2. And I was thinking about trading, but I think trading is the wrong approach here. I think making sure there's activity in this type of position is a lot more important than just trying to trade down into an opposite color bishop ending. Things can still go wrong if it's rook and bishop versus rook and bishop, but I think with 2 rooks on the board for each side, there's just going to be too many concessions they'd have to try to make progress, and I think it's a little less realistic. So I ended up playing rook d8, and I think this was the right choice. They played g3, trying to get some dark square control on the king side. And then I played g5. And this is... I'm very happy with this move. The idea here is if they try to play moves like h4 or f4, I'm prepared to take. One of the biggest things you can do as a defensive player or on the defensive side is trade off some material. And you can imagine here, for example, let's just say h4 and takes. There's no break anymore. I don't know if you've noticed that, but there's not really a good way to make any sort of pawn breaks. Of course, this h7 pawn could be weak, but if you put your king on h6, then it's not weak anymore. Like, there's not really a good way to get attacked. They could try something like bishop c2. There's just too many things that they'd have to do correctly in order to target this h7 pawn, and it's just realistically not going to happen here. So they end up playing king g2. I played rook d6. All I need to do is wait. Rook to a4. And this is something where I have to take. If I allow them to push the pawn, then that's no good. Rook takes a4. Bishop takes. And now, rook to d3. This prevents them from pushing the pawn. And I'm able to go to a3 if I need to, which is really nice. So they go bishop c2. I go rook c3. I'm not really in a rush, actually. For example, if they go a4 now, it's a little bit different where I can actually just get behind the pawn. And their king really can't advance anywhere comfortable. And being behind the pawn, this bishop is doing a great job defending all of these dark squares. It's extremely hard to find any progress for them. So they ended up playing rook e4 here. I played h6, just getting my pawns on dark squares and actually preparing to bring my king over in case I need it for the defense. King f1, king f8, king e2, king to e8, bishop to d3, king to d7, king to e3 now, king to d6, rook to b4, and king c7, just preventing them from getting in and potentially attacking this pawn. The only way I can see them realistically doing it is actually going like rook b8, rook g8, and then like rook g6 or something. It takes a long time, and it's very unrealistic, but if I can prevent them from doing it, then why not, right? That's the only way I can see any progress being made, so if that's the only way, then let's avoid it. King e4, and now I go for h5. And the idea of h5, of course, is to go h4. If I can play h4, then there's genuinely no weaknesses. Like h6 was technically a weakness, but it wasn't an easily attacked one. After h4, there's nothing. So my opponent played rook to c4 check. They could have also tried bishop e2, but of course h4, and for example, if they take, there's just no way to make progress anymore, actually. Genuinely, there's just nothing. They can't push this pawn, ever. This construction is just way too strong, and sacrificing for it in some way is just way too risky, and they can find themselves losing in the game. So we're in a great spot already for drawing. So rook c4 check, king to d6, h3. H4 is something that is worth consideration, but the problem is, what was it here? I believe g4 looks a bit problematic, and the thing is, you're actually potentially looking to play this move f4 at some point, and then you can actually see yourself creating some sort of dark square control with this move g5 in the future. If you could just imagine this pawn being able to push forward, then this pawn would no longer be defended, this pawn would no longer be defended. Things would get pretty rough. So no reason to do that. Just leave things. If they go h4 themselves, then be happy and take everything there. And if they go g4, you can always just trade as well, which simplifies the position a lot, which is good, again, because we're trying to defend here. So rook b3. They're not threatening anything like a4 or whatever, so even though we're stepping away, I think this is a much more appropriate move than playing something like rook a2. If we play rook a2 here, the problem that I have is I just want to make sure that they can't create some sort of position where they're actually able to just enter with this move king to f5 at some point. So I thought it'd be important to stay on the third rank and keep this bishop honest. So king to e3 was played. Rook to a3 again, rook b4, king c7, again, just preventing rook b8, it doesn't hurt. King e2, rook a2 check, king f1, king to d6, and now I don't really care about rook to b8 at all, because I can start actually trying to go on the offensive here with moves even like bishop d4 at some point. They go f4, of course I end up taking, and they end up taking with the pawn. The problem is they would probably want to take like this, but there is also this move bishop to e5, and there's not really a comfortable way to defend this g3 pawn because this a4 pawn's also hanging, right? So if you go rook f3, then also all of a sudden we can take on a4, and it's a game, right? Bishop g6, there is always h4, and even like bishop g3 or something. And white's king is actually a lot less active than ours. We could be trying to push. Realistically, it's probably a draw, but it does look scary visually. So g takes f4 was played, but the second you see h4, you just have to know it's a draw. I offered a draw here. He didn't accept, which is fine. He's a much higher rated player, but I don't see anything they can do. They're blocked off on the second rank. This pawn is completely blockaded. This pawn is blockaded. This pawn is blockaded. This construction perfectly defends everything. And it'll be a challenge just to get their king off the second rank without trading. So they played bishop b1. I played rook b2, which just forces the rooks off now. Takes, a5, and just brought my king over. So I played bishop c1, which is another move trying to prove that, yeah, there's just nothing here. Because the second they play f5, you can see that there's going to just be a blockade. After f5, bishop g5, the bishop can stay on f6. My king can go over to a7, and either I'll be able to shuffle my bishop or I'll be able to shuffle my king in some way. There's genuinely nothing to be done here. And so my opponent finally did offer the draw here, and I had a good result. So yeah, drawing a 23-78 is pretty awesome, especially just from a very complex line. Like, this was not some easy stuff. There's a lot of complications to navigate here, but overall, I think the level of my play was quite decent. I made it harder than I needed to by taking on c3, but in hindsight, you know, anything can be, you know, ripped apart or whatever. I think Vidit said, enjoy the cake before baking a new one, or I don't know what it was. But I should enjoy the victories, the small ones like this, when I'm able to get them. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this game, and I will see you all for round number 2. All right, bye-bye.